I studied the Crusades under the same excellent medieval historian Maurice Keene as Peter knows. And I studied it at a time when it was still a bit of a niche market. The Catholics had rather disowned the Crusades because they didn't feel it had a terribly, positive image. Obviously, Islam had rather rejected the Crusades, had rather dismissed them because the Crusades fundamentally failed. So until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rediscovery of a bit of humiliation after that, they'd rather ignored it. The Greek Orthodox always loathed it because of the sack of Constantinople in 1204 and the split following on the Great Schism. And the Protestants despised it. I happen to be a Catholic, so I've sort of got a sneaking, and of course, it sprung back into people's consciousness after 9/11. And there's a whole raft of new historians that Peter will know, and many of you in the audience will know since then. And there's the great, if you are a soldier as I have been in my time, that's the great image of the knight there, probably a Templar with the red cross on his white circuit. I put this up because the word crusade has been diminished as a historical term in Western Europe, and it's a vigorous action aimed at achieving a particular noble goal. And that is what Eisenhower called his book on the Second World War, Crusade in Europe. And undoubtedly at the heart of it, it had a good versus evil approach to the destruction of Nazism, and we all get that. It was taken up by George Bush, fatally in some ways, after 9/11. This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while. And again, to him, he's a Christian, quite a strong Christian faith. He took it really in the Eisenhower mode of what a crusade was. This, of course, Osama bin Laden, who'd been talking about fatwas and crusades and Zionists and crusaders, absolutely just leapt on that. In this war of civilizations, very much Huntington language, our goal is to unite in the freight of the Christian crusade. And he'd almost taken that up from 1991, when I was a member of the coalition forces that went into the land of the two holy places in Saudi Arabia. So his first aim is overthrow the House of Saud, but also then selectively use the images of entitlement, inspiration and grievance to re-energize the Islamic faith that has had this century, or even more, you could say, of humiliation. And there we are, Richard the Lionheart, Louis from France, Barbarossa, etc. Well known still, if you're selective about your use of history, in the Islamic world. And their crusade capitalized any of several military operations made by Western European Christians in the 11th to the 13th century. It predates it because of the reconquest in Spain was going on at the time, and it postdates it because, of course, there were crusades well into, you may even say, as far as Lepanto or the siege of Malta or the defense of Vienna as late as 1683. There was a papalism. And there's Richard the Lionheart. And a lot of it, of course, focused on the fact that Jerusalem becomes that holy city for all three monotheistic religions. And there's the great Turpentine Saladin there. Hughes very well just pointed out just how rapidly and on what basis the Rashidun and the Umayyads expanded. And if you are a jihadist, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, this can only be because you're divinely inspired. How on earth can you come from nowhere and overturn the great Roman Empire, the great Sasanian Empire, that fast? I mean, literally in 100 years from the death of the Prophet. And Jerusalem is taken very early on. 5 years from the death of Muhammad. It's an extraordinary story of expansion, and it's taken on by the Abbasids, obviously, after that, and eventually the Ottomans, and we'll vaguely come back to that. Here's the great date that people know. There's Alexios Komnenos, the call from the east, comes to see the Pope. We can patch up the great schism of 1054. Will you send a bunch of your, virile, these great, apogee of manhood that Peter was talking about, your knights. It's happened before. A lot of Normans had already fought alongside the Byzantium. He goes to Clermont. It's slightly set up, and he's then going to use the social media of the day, basically the pulpit of the Catholic Church. And unbelievably, of course, the great thing is it's going to be papally led. Adamir is going to lead this, what becomes known as the First Crusade. It's a military pilgrimage, and it's going to actively be a remission of sins. That if you die in battle, you will go straight to heaven. You will bypass those boring years in purgatory. And amazingly, Deus vult. Bang, everybody go, and unbelievably, the preaching from the pulpits generates something, history doesn't quite say, of about 100,000 people. But it's not what the Emperor of Byzantine wants. He wants uniformed, men-at-arms, knights, nobles. He gets peasants, he gets pilgrims, and an extraordinary outpouring of fervor. And again, one's always got to have the context. Death was very close. Issues of heaven and hell, salvation, damnation, God, the devil, etc., really important. And death hovers on your shoulder every day and strikes very, very fast. And again, empathetic to the people of the time, which is why I was slightly critical about how critical the Protestant faith has been during the Enlightenment towards the Crusades. Crusade, what is it? It's a pilgrimage to start with, military objective. Against the Muslims, of course, it expands, which is part of the reason the Crusading ideology gets rather a poor name. It's got to be sanctioned by the papacy. You can't just go off and have a whack at the old Muslims and then say you're on a personal crusade unless it's sanctioned by the papacy. It's law, and it's important if you want to go because you need to have your status in society, your children, your estate guaranteed under papal law. And it's indulgences for remission of sins. Why do you go? Yes, reconquest in Spain. Yes, religious fervor. It's 1,000 years or so since the death of Christ. Pilgrim tradition, defense of Christendom. Peter talked about St. Augustine. Yeah, and some of these, yes or no, land hunger, younger sons, adventure and booty. The Crusaders are driven quite a lot by what I call gap year crusaders. And I mean that without being facetious. People going off from a society that to an extent admires martial fervor, and off they go. Victory in the East, I mean, every one of these, one could have a huge story behind, but off they go. It's launched in 1095, they assemble in 1096, they get caught outside Antioch, and on they go. Jerusalem, 1099, they break in. Godfrey de Bouillon there. Huge massacre. No Christians in the city, all the Jews and Muslims massacred. The start of the Crusader kingdom. There it is, Kingdom of Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa, up in Armenia. And lo and behold, if you want to draw analogies, Zionists and Crusaders, just look at the borders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Israel. If you're looking to be selective, and there's a chap in the front shaking his head, but that is part of the selective narrative of the jihadists, because this is an outpost of Christian Europe. This is an outpost of the new Christian thing. You can make a very selective, powerful approach. Strengths of the kingdom, divisions in the Islamic world, seaports, military orders, etc., but you're going to get the Muslim thing. And that happens at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, destruction of Guy de Lusignan by Saladin. Crusader kingdom absolutely collapses, that's all you're left with. And what you end up with after the Third Crusade is really politically, militarily, a kingdom of no consequence really whatsoever at that stage. But the image is still there. Fourth Crusade ensures totally there'll never be a unified Christian approach to the Islamic threat. You get a number of crusades against Egypt, they fail, there's Louis IX taken captive. And you get the Mamluks and the Mongols. And at this stage, you could have snuffed out Islam if the Mongols had continued beyond the sack of Baghdad and that thing. There you've got the decline of the Crusades. You're using it against heretics, papal aggression, decline of the image, failures, etc., distractions, costs, resignations, everything. Fall of Acre. Ottomans eventually take Constantinople. That means you've got absolutely nothing left of the Eastern Roman Empire. You get that decline. This feeds this idea of Islamic humiliation after the fall of Vienna in 1683. And eventually, Allenby goes in and retakes Jerusalem. After the great counteroffensive, Jerusalem, of course, has been back in Muslim hands since, largely since it's been retaken by Saladin 800 years earlier. And he is told distinctly, don't mention the Crusades. Protestant country. The French are rather less backward-leaning about this. Henri Giroud goes to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and kicks Saladin's tomb there. Awake Saladin, we have returned my presence here, consecrated. Victory of the cross over the crescent. Up to a point, Lord Copper. Eventually, of course, Ataturk abolishes the Sultanate and the organizing principle of the Middle East for nearly 1,400 years. And you're left with, of course, up to a point again. You could talk of this for as long as you like, the Sykes-Picot and da-da-da-da, and the Balfour Declaration, you're left with that. And you just come to the end where you still have the inspirational idea of those early conquests, both, of course, under the Arab leadership of the Sunni world and the Ottoman leadership. Disregard the Iranians and the Shia are there. And what you end up here is, for those nerds like myself who like their medieval history, scene of great medieval prowess there. And if you're a jihadist or you are Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, here are the new Crusaders. So unbelievably interesting, the resurrection of an extraordinary story from way back in the 11th and 13th century. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, brilliant. Tour de force. A couple of quick questions. First question, historians hate the what if question, but what if it had worked? I mean, the Crusades fail.
Yeah.
But you hinted at several points there. It could have gone differently.
I think it's different. Well, it could have. Yarmouk and Qadisiyah is when the Islamic religion could have been stamped out, and I think probably 1258. I don't think the Crusades were ever going to reverse what Hugh was saying on the spread of Islam. I'm not saying. I just think the weaknesses within Christendom, if you're looking again at an organising principle, the split in the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. I think the split between papacy and emperor, I think the split between France and England in due course absolutely stops any idea of some unified policy. There was a time, you might say, after Lepanto, when there was a feeling you could have snuffed out the Ottoman Empire, who knows, taking Constantinople, and then really up until, the real weakness of the Ottoman Empire. But I just never have seen the fact that you're swimming in a sea of Muslims at that stage. And once the divisions within the Muslim world between Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and Baghdad had been ironed out, the great war leader Saladin, then I think they were always too strong. The appeal was never strong enough to drive enough people to come. And the Crusaders were never in the business of conversion. In fact, in many ways, a bit like, again, he was talking about with people who voluntarily converted or were prepared to live under Islam. And it happened again under the Ottomans in the Balkans. The Catholic Church proved to be so flaming orthodox that, if you remember, the great cry was always better the turban of the Turk than the mitre of the Pope. So I don't think they helped themselves. They weren't in the business of actually making themselves an attractive proposition. And ultimately, I think the potential resources of the Muslim world were always going to stamp them out. Which I have to say is, again, what the jihadists, AQ, ISIS would still say now about the state of Israel. We've been through this before.
And as a soldier of renown, tell us a bit about the sort of origins and echoes you see in terms of modern warfare in the Crusades. I mean, you referenced the rhetoric used by the Americans.
Well, all I was saying,
post 9/11.
I'm speaking to an audience that would. I think our failure to teach history properly, to get the facts right, to understand context and be empathetic, has let us down very badly. I think our moment in history, which was sort of 1991, the 90s, the Fukuyama idea, when we were much better studying Huntington to say, actually, we've got to break away from it. We've got to understand ethnicity. We've got to understand religion. We've got to understand geography. We've got to understand confessionalism. And when I was doing the interview earlier, when we went into Iraq in 2003, our failure to understand, dare I say, the difference between Turks, Arabs, and Iranians, the difference between Sunni and Shia, the tribal element, the significance of cities like Baghdad and Damascus to the Muslim culture, really, led to appalling policy decisions. So I feel, again, usual cry for your soldier, politics by other means. It is extraordinary that it's often the soldiers, and we study a lot of military history, but we study it in context, come there and say to our political leaders, what are your political objectives? And then politics is war by other means as well. Get the politics right, we might be able to fight a more sophisticated campaign, and we clearly didn't in Baghdad.